Tom Moushey, 1536 Glen King, Alliance. And I've served on the Board of Zoning Appeals for a number of years, probably 25, and been the chairman for a number of years. This ordinance was passed in 2003, so it's been around about 12 years. And the concept again, what Mike just said, that this is R1 only. It doesn't apply citywide. There are plenty of multiple family zoning areas within the city, and it was intended to be to protect and establish what a single family is and a residence. So yes, you can have big houses, you can have lots of people living there. It's basically what's the definition of a family, and that's what they came up with in 2003 of how best to define that and get away from the concept of having boarding houses and multiple people. Let them live in the multi-family district that we have here in the city of Alliance. There was also a suggestion that this somehow discriminates. I have no idea where that's coming from. It doesn't discriminate against anybody. People can use these properties the way they want and can have ownership. And the statute is not defined on ownership. It's defined on occupancy. Who are the occupants? So the owner can be somebody that's out of town. It could be 5 people own it, 10 people, whatever. It's based on occupancy, not on ownership. And so it's to be occupied by a single family, regardless of how many owners there might be. And it's not uncommon that you would have multiple owners of different properties, even though the owners don't necessarily live there. It's still occupied by a single family. So that's a pretty common arrangement, and that's, in my view, that's the way the code defines it, is based on occupancy, not ownership at all. There was a suggestion about, somebody said early on about a permit, that somehow good landlords could get a permit and bad landlords wouldn't get a permit. I would see that as very difficult to enforce. Having a permit, once it's established, trying to terminate that permit would be very challenging for the city. I think this ordinance has worked well for the 12 years it's been in existence, and maybe just to give you a little flavor, somebody said there has been 20 appeals to the zoning board over this 12-year period of time. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I know we get 2 or 3 every year typically. And the most common scenario that we hear all the time is, I bought this property and they didn't tell me that there was this zoning clause. I planned on renting it. My child was going to college, or we were going to live here with their friends and move in. The realtor never told me, the owner never told me, and it was sold to me under those circumstances. Well, generally we have to discount that because what they were told or not told, we don't know, but the ordinance has been around for 12 years. There's generally been a lot of publicity on this over this 12-year period of time, and it's well known. I think a couple of realtors have established that it's well known in the realtor community that this ordinance has been with us. But that is a common refrain we hear from people at the zoning board. The other refrain that we always hear too is that, gee, I didn't really know how bad this was. This is the landlord talking when all the neighbors come to the zoning board. And what their explanation typically is, there's 3, 4, 5 people living in this house. They all have cars. And this house was built for maybe 2 cars at most. Some of the areas only have 1-car garages, so they're really not even, some neighborhoods don't accommodate 2 vehicles. But now all of a sudden you have 3, 4, 5 cars there. And then all their friends come over, and they have cars. So now all of a sudden you have 6, 8, 10 cars there at the property, and parking becomes a big problem. People are parking in the front yard, they're parking on the street, clogging up alleys, and that's a very typical complaint we hear from the residents when we hear these appeals. The other thing is that there are a complaint is that they're frequently having to call the police department because there's all kinds of parties and noise, typically on the weekends. They go over, talk to the people in the house, generally treated rudely, and then they have to resort to calling to the police. And the police do the best they can under these circumstances, but they're not there 24 hours a day and can't supervise these problems. So that's a common problem that comes up in these situations. Last month we had 2 of these appeals. One was what I would say fits into this typical category, and that is that too many cars, too much parking, usually there's garbage cans and other things cluttering up the street and the front yard and so forth. But the parking situation, there was an unusual twist last month. There was a lady, it was over on South Freedom, South Seneca, older neighborhoods, alleys, for their access to parking. And the cars, too many cars there on a weekend, and one of the neighbors happens to be an emergency nurse who works up in Akron. And she gets called, she's on call, she gets calls in the middle of the night, she has to leave, she can't get out of her driveway because the alley's clogged up with cars in parking. She goes over, tries to get them to move the cars, nobody will answer the door, nobody will respond. So she runs into a major problem just getting to work because of this type of problem. That's unusual. We had never heard that one before. We've heard about problems with parking and clogging up the street and so forth. And then there's the party atmosphere that generally develops in these types of situations. And a common complaint from the neighbors is that there's all the parties, there's the noise, there's people urinating off the front porch, there's all kinds of things going on in what's supposed to be a single-family neighborhood when it takes on a whole different atmosphere when you have that kind of situation. So one other general comment too, that the last couple of speakers were talking about how this was studied by City Council. Well, it was also studied by City Council again in I think 2006 as part of the comprehensive review of the zoning code when the whole zoning code was looked at. And then again, I think it was in 2012 when there were, it was looked at, the new code was looked at a second time for possible amendments, and there were some amendments. And this issue in this ordinance was part of the ordinance. It was discussed at those land use committee meetings, and the decision was to continue it as is, basically, when it was adopted in 2003. So it has been reviewed from time to time by City Council and the different land use committees that were appointed by City Council.
Any questions for Mr. Moushey? Thank you, sir.